Hi, I'm doing this video on the London Bridge attack. I've done other videos on terrorist attacks, and it's appalling to me that nobody wants to examine the reasoning why the terrorists do what they do. First, my condolences to the victims. These are murderous thugs who kill people and deserve to be punished. But there is an important public policy issue that needs to be considered, which is how to handle these homegrown terrorists. Now, these are people that live in the country, and then they decide to do terrorist attacks against their fellow citizens. So how should we deal with this as a public policy? In order to know how to do that, we have to find out what is in our self-interest. We have to examine what is in our self-interest. To know what's in our self-interest, we have to understand the motivation of the terrorist. Now, all terrorists have the same motivation. They all kill people for a political reason. More specifically, they are trying to change the public policy of the country where they do the terrorism. They're trying to increase the cost of a public policy that they disagree with. They're not trying to defeat the country. They know they can't. They know that killing a few people doesn't defeat that country. It doesn't destroy the country. Blowing up a building doesn't do that. What they're trying to do is say, if you continue with this public policy, we will do terrorist attacks. Therefore, you should stop this public policy so that we don't do the terrorist attacks. Now, this is true of all terrorists, and it's always been true. And that's why they do terrorism. So, for example, the IRA terrorists, you recall them? Those Irish people that wanted independence for Northern Ireland. They wanted the British out of Northern Ireland, so they set bombs in London. Were they trying to defeat London? No. Did they do it because they hated the British? No. They may have hated them or may not have. They're doing it because they wanted to get the British out. Now, in that case, what is the self-interest of the British? Well, the self-interest of the British is to do what the majority of the people want in Northern Ireland. If the majority of the people in Northern Ireland, if there's elections and they vote to stay as part of the United Kingdom, then they shouldn't change the public policy. But if, on the other hand, they had voted to get out and they wanted to be part of Ireland, then the British should follow what the terrorist wants. Just because the terrorist wants something doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. You have to analyze the issue independently. So, for example, recently there was a Puerto Rican terrorist who had shot up Congress, and he was given a lot of grandeur and acclamation in New York City. Now, in Puerto Rico, there's been many referendums, and the Independence Party, the one that these Puerto Rican terrorists represented, they always lost by more than 95%. So it would have been wrong for the U.S. to change its policy and go ahead and give Puerto Rico the independence, although they could have done it for other reasons, but not because of the situation of what the Puerto Ricans wanted or what the Puerto Rican terrorists want, because in that case, what's going on? The catering to what these very minority amount of Puerto Rican terrorists wanted was not in the self-interest of the U.S. And the self-interest of every country is to follow the consent of the governed. And in this case, Puerto Ricans wanted to remain part of the United States. So from the Puerto Rican side, it's clear. Now, the Americans could grant Puerto Rico independence if they wanted, because they think it's in American self-interest to grant Puerto Rico independence. That's a whole different issue. So The same thing happened with the Chechens. Now, the Chechens do terrorism against Russia. Now, have the Russians given the Chechens the opportunity to have a referendum and not to be under the control of Russia? No, they haven't. So, in that case, they should change their policy and give a referendum and let the Chechens decide if they want to be separate from Russia. And the same thing applies with the Basque. Now, in the case of these, the Basque, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they were terrorists who bombed Spain. They are part of northern Spain, and they wanted to have a referendum to get out of Spain. And so all terrorists are murderers for political reasons. Sometimes the change in policy that they want is in the self-interest of the country they're trying to affect. Sometimes it's not. It's a matter of examining the policy. Now let's examine the U.S. policy in the Mideast. Let's go back to Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. Now, bin Laden, he set bombs in an embassy, U.S. embassy, killed people, whatever. U.S. didn't change the policy, didn't do anything, didn't even pay attention to it. Then he said, well, I guess they don't care about the embassies. He bombed the USS Cole. Now, did the U.S. change their policy? No, they didn't. What is the policy that bin Laden wanted to have changed? He wanted the Americans out of Saudi Arabia. He was a Saudi. Why? Because once he got the Americans out of Saudi Arabia, he would be able to have a better chance of overthrowing the king. So bin Laden wanted to install a theocracy in Saudi Arabia, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't achieve his political objective because there was another tyrant, which are the Saudi kings. So really, in that case, it's a matter of one tyrant versus another, which is the case in all of these Middle East countries. So his plan was to get the attention of the Americans and increase the cost of our policy, which was to support the kings. We supported the king tyrants and still do. Now, since it didn't work, he said, well, we got to go to the U.S. And they tried to bomb the towers, and they failed first. Then they tried again, and they were successful, of course, because we let them hijack planes by just asking for the plane instead of having locked cockpits and not acceding to terrorist wishes. Was the easiest hijack in the world. Anyway, every time bin Laden made a terrorist attack, he would write a memorandum. Say, Americans, if you just leave the Mideast, we will stop our terrorist attacks. But did anybody publish those memorandums? Did anybody talk about them? Did anybody talk about whether it was a good idea, whether it was in our self-interest not to be involved in these disputes in the Middle East? Nobody talks about it. And so that didn't work. It didn't work for us. It didn't work for the terrorists, because this terrorism is a bad strategy. I'll explain that later. Anyway, the same thing happened in Iraq. We overthrew Saddam, and he was a Sunni. Now, the Sunnis and the Shiites, they hate each other, and they've been fighting for centuries. So when the Sunnis were taken out, we basically installed a Shiite government, in spite of the fact that the Sunni had won an election. Anyway, that's not really important at this point. The point is that now Iraq has a Shiite-controlled government. The Sunnis were out. The Shiites were punishing the Sunnis. The Sunnis decided to start their own little army. And with that little army, they started to gain territory and power, and ultimately were able to use the same weapons that we gave to the Shiites, to the Iraq government, they were able to take them, and they're still using our weapons. So we gave the Iraq people, government, weapons. They abandoned the weapons in the field because they weren't really motivated to fight. And so we created ISIS. Oh, that's the big problem now, ISIS. Well, that's a problem of our creation and using our arms. So I don't know how many more examples I have to give you. It's the same thing over and over and over. You have to identify what is in the self-interest of the United States. America first. Recognize that phrase? America first. That's a good idea. It's just a matter of thinking and deciding what is in the self-interest of America. Now, the self-interest of America is obviously not to support one tyrant over another tyrant. So what's happening in Syria? We are supporting which tyrant? Well, at first we couldn't make up our mind. But initially we supported the Syrian government. This is a tyrannical, murderous government. And now we're undecided what to do. And you can't win. If your choice is to support either one tyrant or other, you're making a mistake. Why do we have to be involved in these disputes between these groups that they're barbarous, primitive people with a middle-aged mentality, and they have to learn for themselves. And both of them are tyrants. So what's the point in supporting one or the other? Besides, it's not the function of the United States to be the world policeman and to decide how countries should run each other. All we have to do with these people is don't mess with us, because if you do, we will annihilate you, bomb the hell out of you. And so, if we do that, we're safe, and let them fight each other for another century if they need to, in order to learn how to live in a civilized manner without trying to overthrow people by force. Now, I said before, terrorism is a stupid strategy, because even if the terrorists win in a country, the lesson that they've taught their people is that instead of doing what I'm doing right here, which is trying to persuade you of what is the right policy, they use force. And so once the people in a country learn that terrorism is a legitimate policy, a legitimate strategy, then doesn't matter what government you have in that country, what will happen? It doesn't matter, because whatever group has power, the other outside group will think, well, all I need to do is do some terrorism and I get back power. So the terrorists is a bad strategy, even for the terrorists if they won. It's also a bad strategy because as you have seen, both in London and in the United States and in France, instead of making people want to make a calculation as to whether the policy is proper or not, whether our intervention in the Mideast makes sense or not, what they do is what? Get angry, and the leaders don't explain terrorism to the people, and the people are angry because these self-grown terrorists are killing people, which is a reason to be angry, and they don't bother to think it through. So that's why we're stuck with this horrible policy, these horrible terrorist attacks. Now, if we did what we should, which is obviously get the hell out of the Mideast, these people are going to trade with us regardless. They'll sell us their oil. Doesn't matter if it's the kings or the theocracy. Iran sells oil all over the world, and to people that are not taking part in their internal politics. By the way, did you notice that the terrorists never attack Argentina or China or North Korea? Well, of course not, because they don't want to influence their policy, because they're not involved in the dispute over there in the Middle East. We're involved, so they want to affect our calculation. So, please let me know what you think. I trying to do my patriotic duty here to offer an explanation as to why terrorists do what they do and what would be the best policy, which is based on our own self-interest, America first, like Trump says. And in this case, it's pretty obvious to anybody who thinks it through, we should get the hell out and let them fight each other. Bye.